They said death was final, that once a body stilled, no breath nor prayer could return it. In the spring of 1805, in a quiet Massachusetts town where church bells marked time and seasons ruled the land, such certainties felt as solid as the granite headstones that dotted the hillside cemetery. The townspeople lived by these truths, found comfort in their predictability, and trusted that nature followed God's immutable laws. Yet sometimes in the space between what we believe and what we witness, terrible possibilities take root. Sometimes the impossible wears such a simple face that we mistake it for a miracle, when perhaps it was always meant to be our damnation. Nathaniel Harrow was a man of science, trained in the great cities of the East, and returned to serve his humble community with knowledge earned through years of study. He had seen birth and death countless times, had closed the eyes of the departed, and welcomed the first cries of the living. He understood the rhythms of the human body, the delicate balance that sustained life, and the unmistakable stillness that marked its end. But on one cold March evening, as winter's grip finally loosened on the Massachusetts countryside, Harrow would encounter something that challenged every principle he held dear. A child whose heart did not beat, yet who would not die. A boy whose existence became both a miracle and a curse, whose silence would speak louder than any scream. The doctor who chose to hide this child, to study him in secret, would learn that some discoveries are too dangerous for the light of day. Some secrets once unearthed cannot be buried again by reason, medicine, or faith. And some prices for knowledge are paid not just by those who seek it, but by everyone unfortunate enough to dwell in its shadow. This is the story of that child, of the doctor who found him, and of the darkness that followed them both into a small New England town where the dead were supposed to stay buried, and the living were supposed to understand the difference. The knock came at Dr. Harrow's door near midnight, urgent and desperate. Through the frosted glass, he could see the hunched figure of Thomas Whitmore, a farmer whose land bordered the deep woods beyond the town. The man's face was pale with exhaustion, and something deeper, a fear that seemed to have settled into his very bones. "Doctor, you must come," Thomas gasped, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "It's my wife, the child. Something's wrong. Something's terribly wrong." Harrow had delivered dozens of babies in his years of practice, had seen complications that would turn a lesser man's stomach, yet something in Thomas's voice made his hands tremble as he gathered his instruments. The ride through the March darkness felt endless, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground like a funeral march. The Whitmore farmhouse sat in shadow, its windows glowing with candlelight that seemed to flicker with an unnatural rhythm. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of herbs and the metallic tang of blood. Mary Whitmore lay exhausted in her bed, her face turned toward the wall, refusing to look at the bundle of cloth beside her. "He was born dead," she whispered, her voice barely audible. No cry, no breath, no movement. "But doctor, his skin won't grow cold. For hours now, he's been like this, and I can't bear to touch him." Harrow approached the infant with the methodical care of his profession, yet his scientific mind reeled at what he discovered. The child appeared perfect in form, pale skin, unmarked by the struggles of birth, features delicate and symmetrical. But there was no heartbeat beneath his fingertips, no flutter of breath to mist a mirror held to tiny lips, no reflexes when light was shone into eyes that remained perpetually half open. Yet the flesh remained warm, supple, as if life still flowed through veins that carried no blood he could detect. The child's eyes, when they occasionally shifted, held a depth that seemed impossible in one so newly born. They were dark, almost black, and they seemed to track movement with an awareness that made Harrow's scientific certainty crumble. "The Lord has cursed us," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "This is punishment for some sin we don't even remember committing." But Harrow saw something else entirely. Here was an anomaly that defied every medical text he had studied, every natural law he understood. His mind raced with possibilities, Suspended animation, some unknown condition that mimicked death while preserving the body. This was not a curse, but a discovery. Perhaps the most significant of his career. "I'll take him," Harrow said quietly, wrapping the child in a clean blanket, "for proper examination and burial preparations." The relief in Mary's eyes was immediate, while Thomas nodded gratefully. They trusted their doctor to handle what they could not understand, to restore order to their shattered world. Harrow assured them that all would be handled with dignity and care, that they need never speak of this night's strangeness again. But as he carried the bundle to his carriage, Harrow felt the weight of his deception settling upon his shoulders like a physical burden. He had no intention of burying this child. The scientific potential was too great, the questions too compelling. In the darkness of his carriage, he looked down at the infant's face and whispered, "Samuel, I shall call you Samuel." The child's eyes shifted toward him at the sound of his voice, and for just a moment Harrow could have sworn he saw something like understanding flicker in their depths. But that was impossible, wasn't it? The dead could not hear, could not comprehend. Yet as the carriage wheels carried them through the night toward his home, Samuel's gaze never left the doctor's face. Harrow's house stood at the edge of town, a respectable two-story structure with a cellar that had served as both storage and, occasionally, a private laboratory for his more delicate research. It was here that he brought Samuel, into a space beneath the earth where shadows danced in candlelight and silence pressed against the walls like a living thing. As he prepared a makeshift cradle and arranged his instruments for examination, Harrow felt the intoxicating rush of discovery. Here was something unprecedented, something that could revolutionize medical understanding of life and death. He would study every aspect of Samuel's condition, document every anomaly, until he understood the mechanism that sustained this impossible existence. But even as he made these plans, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings he chose not to hear. The child's stillness was too perfect, too purposeful. The way those dark eyes followed his movements suggested not the random reflexes of a dying brain, but the focused attention of something that was very much aware. When Harrow finally settled into his chair to begin his observations, Samuel lay motionless in his makeshift bed, eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. Hours passed without the slightest change, no breathing, no blinking, no movement of any kind. Yet the flesh remained warm. The eyes remained alert, and occasionally so faintly that Harrow wondered if he was imagining it. The child's lips seemed to curve in the suggestion of a smile. As dawn approached and the first pale light began to filter through the cellar's high windows, Harrow found himself staring at Samuel with a mixture of fascination and growing unease. The child had not changed, had not deteriorated, had shown no signs of the decay that should have begun hours ago. Whatever Samuel was, he existed in defiance of every natural law Harrow understood. But here's what haunts me most about this story. And I want you to think about this as we continue. What if the moment Dr. Harrow chose to take that child home, he wasn't saving a life, but feeding something that had been waiting in the darkness between life and death for someone foolish enough to invite it in? If this story is drawing you in, if you want to know what horror awaits Dr. Harrow and the town of Massachusetts, make sure to subscribe to this channel and press the bell icon. Because the deeper we go into this tale, the more you'll understand that some discoveries should have remained buried. Spring arrived early that year, yet Dr. Harrow barely noticed the changing seasons. His world had contracted to the confines of his cellar, where Samuel lay in perfect stillness, unchanged by the passing weeks. What had begun as scientific curiosity had transformed into something approaching obsession, consuming Harrow's thoughts and dictating his daily routines. Each morning he descended those stone steps with the eagerness of a man approaching revelation. He measured Samuel's temperature, always precisely that of a living child. He held mirrors to those motionless lips, never a hint of condensation. He pressed his ear to the pale chest, eternal silence where a heartbeat should have resided. Yet the flesh remained supple. The skin retained its color, and those dark eyes continued to track his movements with an awareness that defied explanation. Harrow filled journal after journal with observations, sketches, and theories. He documented the child's every feature, noting how the fingernails seemed to grow at a normal rate despite the absence of circulation, how the hair maintained its fine texture and luster, how the eyes occasionally shifted focus as if following conversations only Samuel could hear. But it was the child's behavior that truly unnerved him. Samuel never cried, never made any sound at all, yet his silence felt purposeful rather than empty. When Harrow spoke aloud during his examinations, explaining his procedures as he might to a medical student, Samuel's gaze would fix upon his face with an intensity that suggested not just hearing but comprehension. "You understand me, don't you?" Harrow whispered during one late-night session, leaning close to Samuel's face. For a moment he thought he saw the child's lips twitch, almost as if suppressing a smile, but the expression passed so quickly he convinced himself it was merely his imagination. The servants began to whisper about strange sounds emanating from beneath the house. Mary, the cook, reported hearing what sounded like conversations in the cellar during the dead of night, though she knew the doctor worked alone. When pressed, she admitted the voices seemed to come from only one person, as if Dr. Harrow was speaking to someone who answered only in silence. Margaret Harrow, Nathaniel's wife of 10 years, watched her husband's transformation with growing alarm. The man she had married was methodical but warm, dedicated to his patients and community. This new version seemed hollowed out, his eyes fevered with a purpose she could not understand. He ate little, slept less, and spoke to her in distracted half-sentences when he bothered to acknowledge her presence at all. "Nathaniel," she said one morning, as he prepared once again to descend to his laboratory, "the congregation has noticed your absence from Sunday services. Reverend Fletcher has inquired about your health." Harrow paused at the cellar door, his hand frozen on the latch. "My work requires my attention. The Reverend will understand." "What work?" Margaret pressed, stepping closer. "You've taken on no new patients, made no house calls in weeks. Whatever research consumes you down there, it's changing you. You're becoming someone I don't recognize." The fury that flashed across Harrow's face startled them both. "You understand nothing of the magnitude of what I'm studying. This discovery will revolutionize our understanding of life itself. History will remember this moment, Margaret. Generations of physicians will study what I document in this cellar." But even as he spoke these words, a part of Harrow recognized their hollowness. What exactly was he documenting? That some children could exist in a state between life and death, that the laws of nature occasionally bent for reasons beyond human comprehension. The more he studied Samuel, the less he felt he understood, and the more desperately he clung to the belief that understanding would eventually come. Meanwhile, Samuel had begun to move on his own, not the random twitching of dying nerves, but deliberate, purposeful motion. Harrow would arrive in the morning to find the child had shifted position during the night, sometimes sitting upright in his makeshift cradle, sometimes standing by the small window that looked out onto the garden above. The child never seemed hungry, never showed distress, never required the basic care that infants demanded. He simply existed, watching and waiting with a patience that felt ancient rather than innocent. When Harrow brought him small toys, rattles and wooden blocks he thought might stimulate some response, Samuel would examine them with his dark gaze but never reach for them, never showing the curiosity typical of his apparent age. One night, Harrow discovered Samuel standing at the cellar window, his small hands pressed against the glass, staring out at the moonlit garden with an intensity that made the doctor's skin crawl. The child's breath, if it could be called that, had fogged the window in strange patterns that almost resembled letters or symbols, though they faded too quickly for Harrow to decipher their meaning. "What do you see out there?" Harrow asked softly, joining Samuel at the window. For the first time since bringing the child home, Samuel turned his head to look directly at the doctor. His expression was not that of an infant, but something far older, far more knowing. In that moment, Harrow felt as though he was being studied with the same clinical detachment he had been applying to Samuel, as if the roles of observer and subject had suddenly silently reversed. The sensation lasted only seconds before Samuel returned his attention to the window, but it left Harrow shaken. He retreated to his chair and tried to resume his notes, but the words would not come. Instead, he found himself watching Samuel with a growing certainty that whatever resided in that small body was not the innocent child he had convinced himself he was protecting. Margaret's concerns about the church were not unfounded. Reverend Fletcher had indeed begun making inquiries, not just about Harrow's absences, but about the doctor's recent behavior. Parishioners spoke of a change in his demeanor, a distraction that bordered on obsession. Some whispered that Harrow had been seen walking the cemetery at odd hours, though what he might be doing there, no one could say. The pressure of maintaining his secret began to wear on Harrow's nerves. Each lie he told to explain his absence, each deflection of Margaret's concerns, each excuse for his isolation felt like another stone added to an already crushing burden. Yet he could not bring himself to reveal Samuel's existence, could not risk losing the child to those who would see only superstition where Harrow saw science. But late at night, when the house was silent and Samuel stood motionless in his corner of the cellar, Harrow sometimes wondered if his scientific rationalization was merely another form of self-deception. Perhaps there were some mysteries that were never meant to be solved, some boundaries that should not be crossed, even in the name of knowledge and discovery. As winter gave way to spring and spring edged towards summer, Harrow found himself trapped between his growing unease and his inability to let Samuel go. The child had become both his greatest triumph and his deepest shame, a secret that was slowly poisoning every other aspect of his life. Yet each morning he descended those stone steps with the same mixture of fascination and dread, drawn by questions he could not answer and afraid of what those answers might reveal. By midsummer, the whispers had begun to spread through the town like a slow-burning fever. It started with the livestock, cattle found dead in the fields surrounding Harrow's property, their bodies unmarked by predator or disease, yet drained of something essential. The animals lay in peaceful poses, as if they had simply chosen to lie down and never rise again, their eyes open but empty of the spark that separated life from death. Thomas Whitmore was the first to voice what others only dared think. Standing in the general store, on a humid July morning, he spoke quietly to anyone who would listen about the strange coincidence of these deaths clustering near the doctor's land. His own livestock had been affected. 3 of his best dairy cows found motionless in their pasture, their milk turned sour in their udders, despite appearing otherwise healthy just the day before. "There's something unnatural about it," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Started not long after. He trailed off, unwilling to speak aloud about that terrible night when his child was born dead, when Dr. Harrow had taken the tiny body away for burial that no one had ever confirmed took place. The children noticed things first, as children often do. They spoke of glimpsed figures by the river at dusk, pale forms that vanished when approached directly but lingered in peripheral vision, like after images of dreams. The youngest daughter of the blacksmith swore she had seen a small boy standing in the cemetery, motionless among the headstones, but when her father investigated, they found only disturbed earth and the faint impression of bare feet in the soft soil. Margaret Harrow felt the weight of these whispers pressing against her like a physical force. In the market, conversations ceased when she approached. In church, she caught sidelong glances that held questions she could not answer because she herself did not know what her husband was hiding in their cellar. The isolation was suffocating, made worse by her certainty that Nathaniel's obsession was somehow connected to the town's growing unease. She had tried to confront Samuel directly, driven by desperation and a mother's instinct that something precious was slipping away from her marriage and her life. One evening, while Nathaniel was called away to tend to a fever in the Miller household, Margaret descended into the cellar with a lantern held before her like a shield against the darkness. Samuel stood exactly where she had expected to find him, motionless by the window, his small form outlined against the fading daylight. He did not turn when she entered, did not acknowledge her presence in any way, yet Margaret felt certain he was aware of her every movement. When she knelt beside him and spoke his name, the name she had heard Nathaniel use in his whispered conversations, the child slowly turned his head toward her. Margaret had birthed no children of her own, but she understood the language of infants, the ways they communicated need and comfort and recognition. Samuel's gaze held none of these familiar signs. Instead, she found herself looking into eyes that seemed to contain depths no child should possess, an intelligence that felt ancient and patient and utterly without warmth. "What are you?" she whispered, reaching out to touch his pale cheek. Samuel's skin was warm beneath her fingertips, but it was the warmth of sun-heated stone rather than living flesh. As her hand made contact, she felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something within her was being drawn towards something within him. The feeling lasted only seconds before she jerked her hand away, but the memory of it lingered like the ache of an old wound. That night, Margaret dreamed of cold water closing over her head, of sinking into depths where light could not reach, and voices called her name from directions that made no earthly sense. She woke to find bruises on her wrist in the exact pattern of small fingers, though she remembered no struggle, no pain, no moment of contact that could account for the marks. Reverend Fletcher's visit came on a Thursday morning when the summer heat pressed against the windows like seeking hands. Margaret received him in the parlor, grateful for company that had nothing to do with her husband's mysterious work, yet dreading the questions she knew were coming. "Mrs. Harrow," the Reverend began, settling his considerable frame into the chair she offered, "I come not as a representative of the church, but as a friend concerned for your family's welfare. Your husband has been absent from our community in ways that go beyond mere physical attendance." Fletcher was a man in his 60s, his hair white as fresh snow, his eyes the clear blue of winter sky. He had served the parish for 30 years and had developed an instinct for spiritual disturbance that went beyond theology. Something was wrong in the Harrow household, something that cast shadows deeper than any earthly concern. "Nathaniel has been consumed by his research," Margaret said carefully, choosing words that felt true without revealing the truth. "He believes he has made a discovery of significant medical importance." "I see." Fletcher's gaze drifted toward the cellar door, visible from where they sat. "And this research requires such isolation, such separation from the community he has served faithfully for years." Margaret followed his gaze and felt her heart quicken. Could he sense what lay beneath their feet? Could he feel the wrongness that seemed to emanate from the cellar, like heat from a forge? "I'm afraid I cannot speak to the details of his work. Medical matters are beyond my understanding." But Fletcher was not so easily dismissed. His years of pastoral care had taught him to read the signs of souls in distress, and Margaret Harrow showed every indication of a woman carrying a burden too heavy for her to bear alone. More troubling still was his sense that this burden was not merely personal, but something that might affect the entire community. "Mrs. Harrow," he said gently, leaning forward in his chair, "if there is anything your husband is doing that troubles your conscience, anything that might affect the welfare of this parish, I hope you know you can speak to me in confidence." For a moment, Margaret felt the words rising in her throat. The truth about Samuel, about the strange sounds from the cellar, about the way her husband had changed from the man she married into something she barely recognized. But fear held her tongue, fear of what might happen to Nathaniel if his secret was revealed, fear of what might happen to the town if it was not. "Thank you, Reverend," she said finally. "If such a time comes, I will remember your kindness." Fletcher left unsatisfied, his pastoral instincts telling him that he had touched the edge of something dangerous but had not been allowed to see its full scope. As he walked back toward the church, he found himself turning to look back at the Harrow house, half expecting to see some sign of the disturbance he felt certain resided there. That evening, as Margaret helped prepare dinner in a kitchen that felt oppressive despite its familiar warmth, she heard Nathaniel's voice drifting up from the cellar. He was speaking in the animated tone he used when explaining complex medical procedures, but she could hear no response, no second voice to justify the conversational quality of his speech. Curiosity finally overcame her caution, and she crept to the cellar door, pressing her ear against the wood. Nathaniel was indeed talking, describing what sounded like the day's observations, but he paused occasionally, as if listening to replies that never came. More unsettling still was the affection in his voice, the tone a father might use when speaking to a beloved child. "You're growing stronger, aren't you?" she heard him say. "I can see it in your eyes, the way you watch and understand. Soon perhaps you'll be ready to see the world above, to take your place among the living." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. Her husband was not just hiding something in their cellar, he was nurturing it, caring for it with a devotion that should have been directed toward their marriage, their life together. Whatever Samuel was, he had stolen more than Nathaniel's attention. He had stolen his heart. As night fell over the town and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Margaret lay in bed beside her husband and listened to his breathing gradually deepen into sleep. But even in dreams, Nathaniel murmured words she could not quite catch, conversations with someone who existed only in the shadowed space between life and death, someone who was slowly, inexorably, drawing her husband away from everything he had once held dear. August brought storms that seemed to roll across the Massachusetts countryside with supernatural intensity, as if the very sky was rebelling against some unnatural presence below. On one such night, when thunder shook the foundations of the Harrow house and lightning turned the world outside into a series of stark black and white photographs, Margaret made the decision that would change everything. She could no longer live with the weight of not knowing. The whispers in town had grown bolder, the strange deaths more frequent, and her husband had become a stranger who shared her bed, but not her world. Whatever secret Nathaniel guarded in the cellar, whatever hold Samuel had gained over him, it was destroying not just their marriage, but threatening something far greater than their personal happiness. Armed with a lantern and a courage born of desperation, Margaret descended the cellar steps during the heart of the storm, when the thunder would mask any sound she might make. The familiar scent of damp stone and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded her of flowers left too long in a closed room, filled her nostrils as she reached the bottom step. The cellar was empty. Margaret held her lantern higher, casting dancing shadows into every corner, but Samuel was nowhere to be found. His makeshift cradle sat vacant, the blankets arranged as if he had simply vanished from their folds, but it was the walls that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Covering nearly every surface were drawings, symbols, markings made in what appeared to be ash, and something darker that gleamed wetly in the lantern light. The images were primitive yet somehow sophisticated, showing scenes that seemed to depict the town from an aerial perspective. The church, the cemetery, the various farms and houses laid out with impossible accuracy for someone who had never walked the streets above. But it was the recurring motifs that truly terrified her. Trees with roots that extended far deeper than any natural growth, connecting underground in patterns that resembled blood vessels or nerve pathways. Rivers that flowed not just across the surface but through caverns and channels that honeycombed the earth beneath the town. And throughout these underground spaces, small figures moved in procession, their arms outstretched as if reaching for something just beyond the frame of each drawing. Margaret traced one of the symbols with a trembling finger, feeling the slight dampness that suggested the markings were recent, perhaps made that very evening. As her fingertip made contact with the substance, which she now realized with horror might be blood, she felt that same strange pulling sensation she had experienced when touching Samuel's face, multiplied tenfold. Images flashed through her mind with the violence of lightning strikes, the cemetery at midnight, graves opening from within rather than being dug from above, pale figures emerging from the earth with dirt still clinging to their burial shrouds. She saw the town as Samuel apparently saw it, not as a collection of buildings and streets, but as a complex network of connections between the living and the dead, with currents of something that might have been energy or influence or hunger flowing between them like underground rivers. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Margaret gasping and disoriented in the cellar that suddenly felt far too small, as if the walls were pressing inward with each breath she took. She stumbled backward, her lantern flame guttering in the disturbed air, and fled up the stairs with the desperate speed of someone pursued by nightmares. She found Nathaniel in their bedroom, already awake and pulling on his clothes with frantic haste. Rain lashed against the windows, and lightning continued to turn the world into a series of photographic negatives, but something in his expression suggested this was not weather that had awakened him. "Where is he?" Nathaniel demanded without preamble, his eyes wild with an emotion Margaret could not immediately identify. "What have you done with Samuel?" "I've done nothing," Margaret said, backing toward the door. "I went to the cellar to finally see what you've been hiding from me, and he was gone." "The walls. Nathaniel, what are those drawings? What has that thing been doing down there while you thought you were studying him?" But Harrow was already pushing past her, taking the stairs 3 at a time in his desperation to reach the cellar. Margaret followed, her heart hammering against her ribs, and arrived to find her husband standing motionless in the center of the room, staring at the walls with an expression of dawning horror. "He was never the subject," Nathaniel whispered, his voice barely audible above the thunder. "I was all this time. I thought I was observing him, studying him, learning from him, but he was studying me, learning about us, about the town, about," he gestured helplessly at the drawings, "about whatever he needed to know." Margaret wanted to comfort him, to bridge the gulf that had opened between them over the past months, but fear held her rooted in place. "What is he, Nathaniel? What did you bring into our home?" Before Harrow could answer, a new sound cut through the storm's fury, a child's laughter, high and sweet and utterly without joy. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the house in ways that defied the laws of acoustics. Margaret grabbed her husband's arm, feeling the tremor that ran through his body at the sound. "We have to find him," Harrow said, but his voice carried no conviction, only the desperate hope of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. "We have to contain him somehow, stop whatever he's planning to do." They searched the house from top to bottom, every room, every closet, every space large enough to conceal a child's form. They found nothing. Yet the sense of presence grew stronger with each passing moment, as if Samuel was always just beyond their perception, watching their frantic efforts with the same patient attention he had once directed toward the world outside the cellar window. It was near dawn when they discovered the truth. Exhausted and defeated, they had returned to the kitchen for coffee and to plan their next steps when Margaret noticed something that made her blood freeze in her veins. The back door, which she had locked securely before retiring the previous evening, stood slightly ajar. But it was not the unlocked door that terrified her. It was the trail of small, wet footprints that led from the threshold across the kitchen floor and toward the stairs. "He came back," she whispered. "He was outside all night, and then he came back. Why would he come back?" Nathaniel followed the footprints with growing dread, noting how they seemed to glow faintly in the pre-dawn light, as if whatever substance had created them possessed some form of luminescence. The trail led up the stairs, down the hallway, and directly to the closed door of their bedroom. Inside, they found Samuel sitting on the edge of their bed, his small form perfectly still in the gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. He was exactly as Nathaniel remembered him, pale, motionless, eyes dark as winter nights. But something fundamental had changed in the hours he had been gone, something that transformed his presence from merely unsettling to actively malevolent. "Hello, Father," Samuel said, and his voice was like the whisper of wind through cemetery gates, like the sound of earth falling on coffin lids, like the final breath of something dying in the dark. I've been exploring your world. It's smaller than I expected, but it will serve my purposes well enough." Margaret pressed herself against the doorframe, every instinct screaming at her to run, to flee this house and never return. But Nathaniel stepped forward, his scientific mind still grappling with the impossibility of what he was witnessing, still seeking rational explanations for the irrational. "Samuel," he said carefully, "where have you been?" The child turned his head with mechanical precision, fixing those bottomless eyes on the man who had claimed him as son and subject. "I visited the places you showed me in your memories, Father. The places you think about when you believe yourself alone. The cemetery is particularly interesting, so much potential there, so many who have been waiting for someone to show them the way back." And in that moment, as thunder rolled across the sky and lightning illuminated the terrible intelligence behind Samuel's innocent features, both Nathaniel and Margaret understood that their greatest fears had only been the beginning. Whatever Samuel was, whatever he wanted, his time in the cellar had been merely preparation for something far more ambitious and infinitely more terrifying. The boy who could not die had been learning, and now his education was complete. September arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to seep into the very bones of the town, bringing with it a sickness that defied every remedy Dr. Harrow had learned in his years of medical practice. Children fell ill with fevers that burned without breaking, their small bodies consumed by a heat that left their skin cold to the touch. They spoke in whispers of dreams filled with pale figures beckoning from the darkness, of voices calling their names from beneath the ground. Harrow moved through the town like a man trapped in a waking nightmare, treating symptoms he could not diagnose, prescribing remedies that provided no relief. Each house call reminded him of his failure, not just as a physician, but as a guardian of secrets too dangerous for the world to contain. Samuel's presence had poisoned everything it touched, and Harrow carried the weight of that knowledge like a stone in his chest. In his own home, the atmosphere had grown suffocating. Samuel no longer remained in the cellar, but moved through the house with the quiet authority of its true owner. He appeared in doorways without sound, stood at windows for hours without apparent purpose, and spoke rarely, but with a voice that carried implications far beyond his words. Margaret had retreated into herself, spending her days in prayer and her nights in sleepless vigilance, as if constant wakefulness might protect her from whatever influence the child wielded. "He's changing," she whispered to Nathaniel one morning, as they watched Samuel standing motionless in their garden, his gaze fixed on something beyond the horizon. Not growing, not aging, but changing, becoming something else. Harrow could not deny what his own observations confirmed. Samuel's features had sharpened, his movements become more deliberate, his silence more weighted with meaning. The child who had once seemed merely suspended between life and death now appeared to be evolving into something that transcended both states entirely. The first death came on a Tuesday morning when the early autumn mist still clung to the ground like smoke from invisible fires. Mary, their cook and housekeeper for 7 years, was found on the cellar floor by Margaret, who had gone to retrieve preserves for breakfast. The woman lay in perfect repose, her hands folded across her chest, her face peaceful as if she had simply chosen to sleep in that cold stone space. But Mary's skin held the same unnatural pallor Harrow had first noticed in Samuel, and her flesh maintained a warmth that should have faded hours earlier. Most disturbing of all was the expression of profound serenity on her face, as if death had come not as an enemy but as a long-awaited friend. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of illness or injury, nothing to explain why a healthy woman in her 40th year had simply ceased to exist. Harrow examined the body with the thoroughness his medical training demanded, but found nothing to satisfy his need for rational explanation. Mary's heart had simply stopped, her lungs had emptied of breath, her brain had ceased its electrical symphony of thought and dream. Yet something about the scene felt orchestrated rather than natural, as if her death had been arranged rather than suffered. "Where is Samuel?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table where Mary had prepared countless meals, his dark gaze fixed on the cellar door. He did not look up when they entered, did not acknowledge their presence or their questions, but something in his posture suggested satisfaction rather than innocence. "Did you do this?" Harrow demanded, kneeling before the child with a desperation that made his voice crack. "Did you somehow cause Mary's death?" Samuel's eyes shifted to meet his, and for a moment Harrow saw something that might have been pity in their depths. "Death is not caused, Father. It is invited." Mary heard the invitation and chose to accept it. She understood what you still struggle to comprehend. "What do you mean?" Margaret said, stepping closer despite every instinct that screamed at her to flee. What did Mary understand? That the boundary between life and death is not a wall but a doorway, Samuel replied, his voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge, and that some of us exist to hold that doorway open for those ready to cross. The implications of these words hit Harrow like physical blows. Mary had not died of natural causes or supernatural intervention. She had been selected, chosen, invited to join something that existed beyond human understanding. And Samuel, the child Harrow had believed he was protecting and studying, had been the one extending that invitation. "You're not alive," Harrow whispered, the truth finally crystallizing in his mind with terrible clarity. "You're not suspended between life and death. You're something else entirely, something that feeds on the transition from one state to the other." Samuel's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it carried no warmth or humor. "I am what I have always been, Father. You gave me a name, created a story to explain my existence, built theories around my nature. But names and stories and theories do not change the truth. They only make it easier for human minds to accept." Margaret sank into a chair, her face draining of color as the full horror of their situation became clear. "How many others? How many deaths will you cause before you're satisfied?" "Cause?" Samuel tilted his head with childlike curiosity. "I caused nothing. I simply offer what some souls secretly desire: release from the burden of breathing, freedom from the weight of consciousness, peace beyond the reach of pain or fear or longing. Mary chose to accept my gift. Others will make the same choice. In time." The casual way he spoke of death as a gift, of human life as something to be offered and accepted, rather than cherished and protected, filled Harrow with a rage that burned away his fear. This thing wearing the face of a child had manipulated him, used his scientific curiosity and paternal instincts to establish itself in his home and community. Mary's death was not the end, but the beginning, the first note in a symphony of destruction that would consume everyone Harrow held dear. "I won't let you continue," Harrow said, rising to his feet with newfound determination. "Whatever you are, whatever power you possess, I'll find a way to stop you." Samuel's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air around him, a subtle alteration in pressure that made both adults feel as though they were standing on the edge of a great height. "You cannot stop what has already begun, Father. The seeds were planted the moment you chose to bring me into your home, to feed me with your attention and care and desperate need to understand. They have taken root now, in the soil of this place and the hearts of its people. Then I'll uproot them," Harrow said, though his voice trembled with the effort of maintaining courage in the face of something so far beyond human power to control or comprehend. "I'll tell the town what you are, warn them of the danger you represent." "And what will you tell them?" Samuel asked, standing and moving toward the window where morning light cast his pale features in sharp relief. "That you stole a dead child from grieving parents. That you hid him in your cellar for months while claiming to conduct medical research. That you allowed him to study your community, to learn its patterns and weaknesses, to identify those most ready to accept the invitation to eternal rest." Each word was a dagger thrust into Harrow's conscience, a reminder of the choices that had brought them to this moment. He had indeed stolen Samuel, had indeed hidden the truth from everyone who trusted him, had indeed allowed his pride and curiosity to override his obligation to protect those in his care. The burden of responsibility lay not with the creature that called him father, but with the man who had claimed that title, despite having no right to it. As the morning sun climbed higher and the sound of church bells drifted across the town, calling the faithful to worship and communion, Harrow understood that Mary's death was not an ending, but a beginning. Samuel had spent months learning, observing, and preparing. Now his true work could commence, and the man who had brought him into the community would be powerless to prevent the harvest that was about to begin. Reverend Fletcher arrived at the Harrow house on a grey October morning, uninvited, and carrying a leather satchel that seemed to weigh heavily in his weathered hands. The sickness had spread through the parish like wildfire, claiming 3 more lives in the weeks following Mary's death, and the Reverend's pastoral instincts had finally crystallized into terrible certainty about their source. Margaret received him at the door, her face gaunt from sleepless nights and constant vigilance. The house behind her seemed to exhale shadows, and Fletcher could sense a wrongness that made his skin crawl, and his prayers feel insufficient against whatever darkness had taken root beneath this roof. "Mrs. Harrow," he said gently, "I must speak with you and your husband about matters that concern the welfare of our entire community. There are things that must be said, truths that must be acknowledged, before more innocent souls are lost." They gathered in the parlor where autumn light struggled through windows that seemed to resist illumination, casting everything in muted tones that reminded Fletcher of funeral shrouds. Nathaniel sat rigid in his chair, his eyes darting constantly toward the doorway, as if expecting an unwelcome visitor. Margaret perched on the edge of her seat like a bird ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. Reverend Harrow began, but Fletcher raised a hand to silence him. "Dr. Harrow, I have served this parish for 30 years. I have seen birth and death, joy and sorrow, faith and doubt in all their myriad forms. But what has befallen our community in recent months, this goes beyond natural sorrow into something that threatens the very foundations of God's order." Fletcher opened his satchel and withdrew several yellowed documents, their edges brittle with age and their surfaces covered in the careful script of long-dead hands. "These are records I discovered in the church archives, accounts dating back to the earliest days of our settlement. They speak of events that mirror what we are experiencing now." He spread the documents on the table between them, his fingers tracing lines of text that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. In 1660, a child was found dead in the woods beyond what is now Miller's Farm. The family claimed he had been stillborn, yet when they attempted to bury him, the infant's body would not decay. Within days, a sickness spread through the settlement, the same inexplicable fevers, the same peaceful deaths, the same sense of wrongness that pervades our community today. Margaret leaned forward despite her fear, drawn by the horrible fascination of seeing their private nightmare reflected in the historical record. "What happened to the child?" "The family tried to care for him, believing his condition was some form of divine miracle," Fletcher continued. "But as deaths mounted and the surviving colonists grew desperate, they began to understand that they faced not a blessing but a curse. The child was not of God's making, but something far older and more terrible." Harrow's face had gone pale as parchment. "You're speaking of superstition, Reverend. Ancient fears and primitive understanding masquerading as historical fact." "Am I?" Fletcher's eyes bore into him with the intensity of a man who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back. "Then explain the pattern, Dr. Harrow. Explain why the same sequence of events has been recorded 7 times in our region's history, always beginning with the discovery of a child who appears dead yet will not die, always culminating in a harvest of souls that leaves communities decimated and survivors scattered to the winds." He pointed to another document, this one bearing an official seal that had faded but remained recognizable. 1723, in Salem. 1756, near Providence. 1781, in the Connecticut River Valley. Each time, the same story. Each time, families who believed they were protecting an innocent child discovered too late that they had invited something demonic into their midst. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of footsteps in the hallway above, small feet moving with deliberate slowness across the wooden floors. All three adults looked up, their faces reflecting the same mixture of fear and recognition. Samuel was listening, had probably been listening all along, and Fletcher's words had not gone unnoticed by the very entity they described. "There's more," Fletcher said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The records speak of signs that precede the final calamity. Livestock dying without cause, children falling ill with fevers that burn cold, graves disturbed from within rather than without, and always the presence of the child in places where the dead are laid to rest." Margaret's hand flew to her throat. "The cemetery, Samuel, has been seen there, hasn't he? That's what the children have been reporting, what Thomas Whitmore whispered about in the store." Fletcher nodded grimly. "The child does not simply bring death, Mrs. Harrow. He brings something worse, the corruption of death's natural order. Those who accept his invitation do not find peace in their graves. They become part of whatever network he serves, whatever purpose drives him to move from community to community, leaving destruction in his wake." Harrow's scientific skepticism warred with the mounting evidence of his own observations. Everything Fletcher described matched what he had witnessed, what he had documented in his journals during those months of misguided research. Samuel's drawings on the cellar walls, his knowledge of the town's layout, his patient observation of patterns and relationships, it all pointed to an intelligence that was ancient, systematic, and utterly malevolent. "What do the records say about stopping him?" Harrow asked, his voice barely audible. "How did the previous communities end the curse?" Fletcher's expression grew even more grave. "Fire, Dr. Harrow. In every case, fire was the only solution. The child and everything he had touched had to be burned, the ashes scattered in running water, the ground blessed and consecrated anew, but the cost," he gestured to another document. "Entire families consumed by flames, houses and churches reduced to ash, communities abandoned as cursed ground that could never again support human habitation." "You're asking us to destroy everything," Margaret said, her voice hollow with despair. "Our home, our lives, our very existence in this place." "I am telling you," Fletcher replied, "that if we do not act soon, there may be nothing left to save. The sickness will spread, the deaths will multiply, and when Samuel's work here is complete, he will move on to fresh hunting grounds, leaving behind only empty houses and disturbed graves." The footsteps above had ceased, replaced by a silence that felt expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Fletcher gathered his documents with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of historical precedent and pastoral responsibility pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. "I will return tomorrow evening," he said, rising to his feet with the slow deliberation of a man carrying terrible knowledge. "Gather what members of the parish you can trust, those who have not yet fallen under the child's influence. We will need every faithful soul if we are to succeed where others have failed." As Fletcher prepared to leave, Samuel appeared in the doorway with the silent suddenness that had become his trademark. The Reverend stopped cold, his face draining of color as he looked upon the pale child whose dark eyes held the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent harvesting human souls. "Hello, Reverend," Samuel said, his voice carrying undertones that seemed to resonate in Fletcher's bones. "I enjoyed listening to your stories about my predecessors, such industrious children, each one adding to the great work that spans generations and continents. Soon you will understand the honor of contributing to that legacy." Fletcher clutched his satchel against his chest like a shield, whispered a prayer that felt thin and inadequate against the presence before him, and fled into the gray October afternoon. Behind him, Samuel's laughter followed like the sound of wind through cemetery gates, a promise that the Reverend's plans had already been anticipated and countered by an intelligence far older than human faith or courage. That night, as Margaret and Nathaniel huddled together in their bedroom while Samuel moved through the house below with the quiet confidence of its true master, they both understood that Fletcher's warning had come too late. The harvest had already begun, and they were no longer its opponents, but merely its next victims, waiting their turn to accept the invitation that would transform their fear into the peace of eternal silence. The town awoke on Halloween morning to a horror that shattered the last vestiges of rational explanation and plunged the entire community into primal terror. Every grave in the hillside cemetery had been opened from within, the earth pushed aside by forces that worked from beneath, rather than above. Coffins lay split and empty, their contents vanished without trace, save for the strange tracks that led into the surrounding woods, footprints too small and numerous to belong to any earthly creature. Thomas Whitmore was among the first to discover the desecration, having come to visit his father's grave with flowers from his wife's garden. What he found instead was a landscape that seemed lifted from the deepest circles of hell, mounds of displaced earth, broken headstones, and an absence of peace that made the very air feel thick with malevolence. His screams brought others running, and soon a crowd had gathered to witness what no community should ever have to see. Reverend Fletcher stood among the ruins of his churchyard, his face aged a decade in the space of a single morning. The careful plans he had made, the faithful souls he had intended to rally, all of it felt pitiful and inadequate in the face of this supernatural assault on the very foundations of Christian burial. The dead were supposed to rest until the final trumpet called them to judgment, not rise at the beckoning of some unholy child who wore innocence like a mask. "God preserve us," he whispered, kneeling beside a grave that had held the body of Sarah Miller, a young mother who had died in childbirth just the previous spring. The coffin lay open like a mouth frozen in an eternal scream, its silk lining shredded as if torn by desperate fingers. "What has been unleashed upon us?" The answer came not in words but in witnessing, as the crowd turned as one toward the tree line that bordered the cemetery. There, moving with the slow majesty of a funeral procession, came Samuel leading a parade of figures that had once been the pride and sorrow of the community. They walked with the peculiar gait of those who had forgotten the weight of flesh, their burial clothes hanging loose on forms that seemed to shimmer between substance and shadow. Margaret Harrow stood among the horrified townspeople, watching her husband's adopted son lead the risen dead in a dance that defied every law of nature and faith. The figures moved with purpose rather than confusion, their eyes fixed not on the living but on something beyond human perception, as if they were following directions only they could hear or understand. "My God," Thomas breathed, recognizing faces from his childhood, neighbors and friends and family members who had been laid to rest with all the dignity and ceremony their faith demanded. "They're all here. Everyone who died in the past year, everyone who accepted his invitation." Samuel stood at the center of his congregation with the serene confidence of a conductor before his orchestra. He had grown during his time in the Harrow house, not physically, for his form remained that of an infant, but in presence and authority. The air around him shimmered with an energy that made watching eyes water and believing minds reel with vertigo. "Citizens of this place," Samuel said, his voice carrying across the cemetery with impossible clarity, "you have lived in ignorance of your true nature, clinging to flesh that decays and dreams that fade. I offer you the gift my companions have already accepted, freedom from the burden of breathing, release from the tyranny of time." Some in the crowd began to weep, others to pray, still others to back away toward the perceived safety of the town proper. But a few, those who had been touched by the strange sickness, those who had felt the weight of Samuel's attention during his months of observation, stepped forward with expressions of profound longing. The invitation was being extended to the living now, and some souls found it irresistible. "No," Fletcher shouted, pushing through the crowd to place himself between Samuel and the townspeople, who seemed drawn to his offer. "Do not listen to his lies. This is not salvation but damnation, not peace but eternal servitude to forces beyond human understanding." Samuel's gaze fixed upon the Reverend with something that might have been amusement. "Your faith speaks of eternal life, does it not, shepherd of souls? I simply offer it without the burden of waiting, without the uncertainty of judgment, without the fear of falling short of arbitrary standards set by a distant and silent God." "The life you offer is not life at all," Fletcher replied, his voice growing stronger as his pastoral authority asserted itself. "You are dead wearing the face of a child, corruption masquerading as salvation. I call upon the power of Christ to cast you back to whatever pit spawned you." The confrontation might have continued, but it was interrupted by a new horror. From the woods came more figures, not the recently dead who had answered Samuel's call, but older corpses, beings that had lain on earth for decades or centuries. They moved with the shambling gait of true revenants, their forms partially consumed by decay yet animated by the same force that sustained Samuel himself. Margaret realized with sick certainty that these were the previous victims Fletcher had described in his research, the dead from other communities where Samuel or his predecessors had worked their terrible harvest. They had been following him across the landscape of New England like a plague that left spiritual desolation in its wake. "Run," she whispered, then louder. "Run. Everyone runs. Get away from this place." The crowd broke apart like water against stone, scattering toward the town in a chaos of screaming voices and pounding feet. But even as they fled, some looked back with expressions of longing, as if a part of them recognized the truth in Samuel's offer, that life was indeed a burden, that consciousness was indeed a weight, that the peace of non-existence held its own terrible appeal. Harrow found himself among those fleeing, his scientific mind finally accepting what his training had refused to acknowledge. Samuel was not a medical anomaly, but something far more dangerous, a force of entropy given form, a manifestation of the death wish that lurked in every human heart. The child's months of study had not been aimed at understanding life, but at perfecting his ability to make death seem desirable to those who still drew breath. Behind them, as the last of the living disappeared into the safety of distance, Samuel stood surrounded by his growing congregation of the willing dead. His work in this place was nearly complete, the harvest gathered, the invitation extended to all who might accept it. Soon he would move on to fresh hunting grounds, leaving behind another community transformed from a place of life and hope into a monument to the seductive power of eternal rest. The night that followed was one of barricaded doors and sleepless vigil, of prayers whispered in trembling voices and weapons clutched by hands that understood their inadequacy. The dead walked freely through the streets of the town now, no longer confined to cemetery plots or cellar hideaways. They moved with purpose and patience, waiting for the fear to exhaust itself, for the living to recognize the futility of resistance, for the final few holdouts to accept what their neighbors had already discovered, that death was not the enemy they had been taught to fear, but the friend they had been waiting their entire lives to meet. In the hollow silence that followed the night of the graves, when dawn brought no comfort and the town lay paralyzed by a terror beyond naming, Dr. Nathaniel Harrow finally found the courage to speak the truth he had hidden for so many months. Sitting in his study with Margaret beside him, and the weight of his guilt pressing against his chest like a physical burden, he began the confession that should have come far sooner. "I lied to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lied to the Whitmores, to the town, to myself. Samuel was never stillborn, never truly dead in the way I let everyone believe." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap, though whether from anger or grief, Harrow could not tell. Outside, the morning light seemed reluctant to fully emerge, as if even the sun hesitated to illuminate what their community had become. "When I arrived at the Whitmore farm that night," Harrow continued, "I found Thomas and Mary in despair over a child who showed no signs of life, no heartbeat, no breath, no response to stimulation. But as I examined him, preparing to confirm their fears, I saw something that changed everything, a flicker of movement behind his eyelids, so brief I might have imagined it. He paused, remembering that moment when scientific curiosity had overridden moral obligation, when the desire for discovery had silenced the voice of conscience. Any ethical physician would have reported that observation, would have continued monitoring the child for further signs of life. Instead, I saw an opportunity for research that might revolutionize our understanding of the boundary between life and death. "So you stole him," Margaret said, her voice hollow with the weight of understanding. "You took him from parents who had a right to know their child lived, who deserved the chance to care for him themselves." "I convinced myself I was acting in the best interests of science, of medicine, of human knowledge itself," Harrow said. "I told the Whitmores their son had died, arranged for a funeral with an empty coffin, and brought Samuel here to study in secret. I believed I could unlock the mystery of his condition, perhaps find a way to help others in similar circumstances." But even as he spoke these words, Harrow knew they were inadequate justification for what he had done. The truth was simpler and more damning. He had wanted the glory of discovery, the recognition that would come from documenting a medical phenomenon unprecedented in human history. His theft of Samuel had been motivated not by noble scientific purpose, but by the basest form of professional ambition. "The months that followed," he continued, "I documented everything: Samuel's unchanging temperature, his lack of respiration, his apparent awareness despite the absence of detectable brain activity. I convinced myself I was conducting legitimate research, that my observations would eventually yield understanding." Margaret stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the town that now lay under the shadow of supernatural threat. "But he was studying you as well, wasn't he? Learning about us, about our community, about our weaknesses and fears." "Yes," Harrow admitted. "Every conversation I had with him, every moment I spent in his presence, every piece of information I shared about our lives here, he absorbed it all. I thought I was teaching him, helping him understand the world. In reality, I was providing him with intelligence about his next hunting ground." The weight of this revelation settled between them like a physical presence. Samuel had never been the passive subject of Harrow's research, but an active participant in his own dark purpose. The months in the cellar had not been imprisonment, but education, preparation for the harvest that was now unfolding with terrible efficiency. "There's something else," Harrow said, forcing himself to speak the words that would complete his confession. "The night I first brought him home, when I was preparing my initial examination, Samuel opened his eyes and looked directly at me. Not the random eye movement of a dying brain, but focused, purposeful attention. And for just a moment I could have sworn I heard a voice in my mind, not words, but meaning communicated directly to my thoughts." Margaret turned from the window, her face pale with dawning horror. "What did it say?" "Thank you," Harrow whispered. "It thanked me for bringing it home, for giving it shelter and protection, while it learned what it needed to know." At that moment I understood that I hadn't discovered Samuel. He had been waiting for me to find him, waiting for someone prideful enough and foolish enough to provide him with exactly what he needed. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of footsteps on the stairs, small feet moving with deliberate slowness toward the study where they sat. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, while Harrow felt his heart begin to race with the familiar mixture of fascination and terror that Samuel's presence always inspired. The child appeared in the doorway with his characteristic silent suddenness, his dark eyes taking in the scene with an expression that might have been approval. He had changed again during the night of the graves, his features sharpening further, his presence expanding to fill space that seemed too small to contain him. "Father," Samuel said, and the word carried undertones of affection twisted into something alien and unsettling. "I'm pleased to hear you finally speaking honestly about our relationship. Truth is so much more beautiful than the lies you told yourself during our time together." Harrow forced himself to meet Samuel's gaze, though doing so felt like staring into an abyss that threatened to swallow his sanity. "What are you? Not what you pretend to be. What you really are beneath the appearance of a child." Samuel smiled, and the expression was perhaps the most terrifying thing Harrow had ever witnessed, innocent in form but ancient in meaning, beautiful in its perfection, but utterly devoid of anything resembling human warmth. "I am exactly what you invited into your home, Father. I am the thing that dwells in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, in the silence that follows the last words of the dying. I am the peace that comes after suffering, the rest that follows exhaustion, the stillness that replaces struggle." "You're dead," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. "Not a child who cannot die, but death itself wearing the mask of innocence." "Death is such a crude word for what I represent," Samuel replied, moving into the room with steps that made no sound on the wooden floor. "I am transformation, evolution, the next step in existence for those ready to abandon the burden of breathing. Your neighbors understood this, Father. They welcomed the change I offered them." Harrow felt the last vestiges of his scientific skepticism crumble in the face of Samuel's casual admission. This was not a medical anomaly or supernatural phenomenon, but something far more fundamental, a force of nature given consciousness and purpose, an aspect of reality that human minds were not equipped to fully comprehend. "Why me?" he asked. "Why was I chosen to find you, to bring you here?" Samuel's expression became almost paternal, as if he were explaining something simple to a beloved but slow child. "Because you possessed the perfect combination of curiosity and pride, knowledge and isolation, authority and ambition. You were exactly what I needed. Someone respected enough to move freely through your community, intelligent enough to provide me with detailed intelligence about potential subjects, and prideful enough to keep our arrangement secret until my work was complete." The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and precision. Samuel had not simply used Harrow's weaknesses, he had cultivated them, fed them, shaped them to serve his purposes. The doctor's love of discovery, his need for recognition, his willingness to sacrifice ethics for advancement, all of it had been carefully exploited by an intelligence that understood human nature with the clarity of centuries spent studying it. "And now?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite the terror that filled her eyes. "What happens to us now that your harvest is complete?" Samuel turned his attention to her, with the same patient focus he had once directed toward the world outside the cellar window. "Now you have the same choice I offered your neighbor's mother. You can cling to the illusion of life, with all its pain and uncertainty and inevitable decay, or you can accept the gift of permanent peace, of existence without suffering, of consciousness freed from the tyranny of flesh." The invitation hung in the air between them like a physical presence, and Harrow felt its terrible appeal working on his exhausted mind and conscience-stricken soul. After months of carrying the weight of what he had done, after witnessing the horror his choices had unleashed upon innocent people, the prospect of simply laying down that burden forever held an attraction that terrified him with its intensity. But Margaret's hand found his, her grip anchoring him to the world of the living with a strength born of love rather than fear. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever peace you offer comes at the cost of everything that makes us human. We choose to remain as we are, flawed and mortal and alive." Samuel's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous for a child's mouth. "Time will change your mind, Mother. Time and isolation, and the gradual understanding that you are the last of your kind in a place that no longer belongs to the breathing. But I am patient. I have all of eternity to wait for your decision." As he turned to leave, pausing in the doorway like a shadow cast by candlelight, Samuel spoke once more to the man who had claimed to be his father. "Thank you, Dr. Harrow, for providing me with everything I needed to complete my work here. Your community's transformation could not have been accomplished without your invaluable assistance." And with that, he was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of flowers left too long in a closed room, and the terrible understanding that their nightmare had only just begun. The mob came at dusk on the 1st of November, their torches casting dancing shadows against the grey sky like earthbound stars bent on destruction. Led by Reverend Fletcher and fueled by a desperation that had finally overcome their fear, the surviving townspeople marched toward the Harrow house with the grim determination of those who understood they faced their last chance at salvation. Thomas Whitmore walked among them, his face haggard with grief and guilt. He had lost his wife to Samuel's influence the previous night, found her standing in their garden at dawn, her eyes empty of everything that had made her Mary, her voice speaking of the peace that awaited beyond the burden of breathing. She had not fought when he led her to the church, had not protested when Fletcher tried to bind her with blessed rope, had simply smiled with profound serenity until she faded away like morning mist, leaving nothing behind but the scent of grave earth. "Dr. Harrow," Fletcher called as the crowd assembled before the house that had become the epicenter of their community's destruction. "In the name of God and the safety of Christian souls, we demand you surrender the demon child to holy fire." Margaret appeared at an upstairs window, her face pale as parchment in the torchlight. Behind her, Harrow's form was barely visible, hunched with the weight of guilt and horror. The house around them seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, its windows reflecting the mob's flames like the eyes of some great beast awakened from slumber. "He's not here," Margaret called down, though her voice carried no conviction. "Samuel left this morning, went into the woods with the others." But the crowd had grown beyond reason, beyond the ability to distinguish truth from desperate hope. They had watched their neighbors, their families, their very way of life consumed by something they could not understand or fight through conventional means. Fire was their last resort, their final weapon against an enemy that existed outside the natural order. "Then we'll burn the nest he made," someone shouted from the crowd. "Burn it all and scatter the ashes so nothing of his corruption can remain." The first torch flew through the parlor window in a shower of glass and flame, followed by others as the mob's desperation transformed into action. Margaret screamed and disappeared from the window, while Harrow's voice could be heard calling her name from somewhere within the rapidly igniting structure. But they were not alone in the house. Samuel materialized in the front hallway as if stepping through a doorway that existed only for him, his pale form untouched by the growing flames that licked at the walls around him. The child who had brought death to their community stood surrounded by fire like some inverse angel, beautiful and terrible, and utterly without fear. "Father," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of crackling wood and distant shouting, "they seek to destroy what cannot be destroyed, to burn what exists beyond the reach of earthly flame. How little they understand about the nature of what they face." Harrow descended the stairs, his medical bag clutched in one hand and Margaret's arm grasped firmly in the other. Smoke was beginning to fill the house, and the temperature was rising with each passing second, yet Samuel seemed as comfortable as if he were standing in a spring meadow. "We have to get out," Harrow gasped, his eyes streaming from the acrid smoke. "The whole house is going up. We'll be trapped." "Trapped?" Samuel tilted his head with that characteristic expression of childlike curiosity. "But Father, this fire is not your enemy. It is liberation, purification, the final gift I can offer you after all you've done for me." Margaret pulled away from her husband's grasp, backing toward the rear of the house where flames had not yet penetrated. "Nathaniel, we have to run. Whatever he says, whatever he promises, we cannot stay here." But Harrow found himself frozen between his wife's desperate plea and something in Samuel's voice that spoke to the deepest chambers of his guilty heart. The child was right. The fire was not punishment but release, not destruction but transformation. After months of carrying the weight of what he had done, the prospect of simply letting go held an appeal that made his knees weak with longing. "The cellar, Father," Samuel said, extending his small hand toward the man who had claimed to be his protector and teacher. "Come with me to the place where our relationship began, where you first understood the magnitude of what you had discovered. Let us complete our journey together." The flames were spreading faster now, consuming the house with supernatural speed, as if the very air had become combustible. Outside, the mob's shouts grew more urgent as they realized people were still trapped inside, but none dared approach close enough to offer rescue. The Harrow house had become a beacon of destruction visible for miles, its fire fed by forces that had nothing to do with wood and cloth and earthly fuel. "Margaret, go," Harrow shouted, pushing his wife toward the kitchen where a door led to the garden and safety beyond. "Get away from here, as far as you can. Don't look back." She hesitated at the threshold, torn between her instinct for survival and her unwillingness to abandon the man she had loved for 10 years. But the heat was becoming unbearable. The smoke was filling her lungs, and something in Harrow's eyes told her that his choice had already been made. "I love you," she called through the roar of flames, and then she was gone, stumbling through the door into the blessed coolness of the November evening. Harrow turned back to find Samuel waiting patiently beside the cellar door, his expression serene despite the inferno that surrounded them. The child's skin seemed to glow with its own light, as if the fire that consumed everything else only served to illuminate his true nature more clearly. "Why the cellar?" Harrow asked, though he was already moving toward the door that led to the space where their relationship had begun and flourished in secret. "Because it represents the truth of what I am, Father," Samuel replied, opening the door to reveal stone steps that descended into darkness deeper than the absence of light should allow. Underground, in the space between the living world and the realm of the dead, where transformation occurs and new possibilities take root. They descended together, doctor and patient, father and son, scientist and subject, into a cellar that seemed to expand beyond its physical boundaries as they moved deeper into its depths. The fire above became distant, muffled, as if they were sinking into water rather than walking down familiar stairs. "I understand now," Harrow said, his voice echoing strangely in the underground space. "You were never the subject of my research. I was the subject of yours. Everything that happened, every choice I made, every step that led us to this moment, you orchestrated it all." Samuel smiled with genuine affection, the expression of a teacher pleased with a student's breakthrough. "Not orchestrated, Father. Invited, encouraged, nurtured. You always had the choice to act differently, to make decisions based on ethics rather than ambition. I simply provided you with opportunities to reveal your true nature." Above them, the house continued to burn with flames that seemed to reach toward heaven itself, a pillar of fire that would be visible from neighboring towns and remembered in local legend for generations to come. The mob watched in fascination and horror as the structure that had harbored their community's destroyer was consumed by forces beyond their understanding or control. But in the cellar, time seemed to move differently. Harrow found himself sitting in the chair where he had conducted his observations, while Samuel stood before the window that looked out onto absolute darkness. Between them stretched months of shared existence, of conversations and discoveries, and the gradual corruption of everything Harrow had once believed about himself and his profession. "What happens now?" Harrow asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Now you rest, Father," Samuel said, turning from the window to face the man who had given him shelter and education and access to an entire community of potential subjects. "You have carried the burden of consciousness long enough, struggled with guilt and fear and the weight of moral responsibility until your soul can bear no more. I offer you the same gift I gave your neighbors, peace beyond understanding, existence without suffering, the stillness that comes after the final heartbeat." Harrow felt the invitation working on his exhausted mind like a drug, dissolving his resistance and replacing his fear with something that might have been gratitude. The fire above seemed distant now, irrelevant, as if it belonged to a world he was already leaving behind. Samuel's offer was not death but transformation, not ending but beginning, not punishment but reward for services rendered. "Will it hurt?" he asked, the question of a child seeking reassurance from a parent. "Pain is for the living, Father," Samuel replied, moving closer with steps that made no sound on the stone floor. What I offer exists beyond such crude sensations, in a realm where thought continues without the burden of flesh, where consciousness persists without the tyranny of time. As Samuel's small hand touched his forehead, Harrow felt the last of his resistance crumble like a dam giving way to irresistible pressure. The cellar around him began to fade, replaced by visions of endless corridors stretching through dimensions that human geometry could not describe, populated by figures he recognized as his former neighbors and patients, all moving with the same purposeful serenity toward destinations that promised eternal rest. Above, the Harrow house collapsed in a shower of sparks that painted the November sky with brief, brilliant stars. Margaret stood among the crowd, watching her former life reduced to ash and ember, tears streaming down her face for the man she had loved and lost to forces beyond human comprehension. But in the depths of the earth, where fire could not reach and time moved according to different laws, Dr. Nathaniel Harrow finally found the peace that had eluded him in life, joining the congregation of souls who had accepted Samuel's invitation to exist beyond the boundaries of mortality. The child who was not a child stood alone in the ruins of his temporary home, patient as always, ready to move on to fresh hunting grounds, where new communities waited to learn the truth about the seductive power of eternal rest. Margaret Harrow lived for 7 years after the burning of her home, 7 years of exile and investigation that took her across New England in search of answers that might explain what had befallen her community. She settled in Providence, where the bustle of a larger city provided some shield against the memories that haunted her dreams, but the work she undertook consumed her waking hours with the intensity of a sacred mission. In libraries and church archives, in the collections of historical societies and the private papers of old families, she searched for any trace of Samuel or beings like him. What she discovered painted a picture of horror, stretching back centuries, a pattern of destruction that followed the expansion of European settlements across the continent, like a shadow trailing in the wake of civilization itself. The records were fragmentary, scattered, often dismissed as superstition or mass hysteria by modern scholars who had no frame of reference for the truth they described. But Margaret learned to read between the lines, to recognize the telltale signs that marked Samuel's passage through communities that had once thrived and now existed only as ruins overgrown by forest, or as names on maps that marked nothing but empty spaces. Salem, 1672, an entire village found empty one winter morning, houses intact, but inhabitants vanished. The only clues a series of children's drawings found in the church depicting figures rising from underground caverns. Plymouth, 1698, a plague that killed without fever, leaving victims in poses of peaceful repose, their faces bearing expressions of profound serenity, despite the terror such deaths should have inspired. Hartford, 1734. Mass disappearances preceded by reports of a pale child seen in the cemetery at midnight, speaking to the headstones as if conducting conversations with their occupants. Each account added another piece to the puzzle. Margaret was assembling a comprehensive picture of an entity that moved through human communities, like a harvester through grain fields, selecting and gathering souls with the patience of something that measured time in centuries rather than seasons. The child never aged, never changed, never deviated from patterns established long before European feet touched American soil. But it was in the private journal of a Puritan minister named Increase Mather, hidden away in a collection donated to the Harvard Library, that Margaret found the most chilling revelation of all. Mather had encountered Samuel, or a being identical to him, in 1663, and his account provided details that no official record would ever have dared preserve. The creature that wears the shape of innocence, Mather had written in his careful script, is not of this world nor the next, but something that exists in the spaces between. It feeds not on flesh nor blood, but on the transition from life to death, growing stronger with each soul that accepts its invitation to cross the threshold. Most terrifying of all is its intelligence. Ancient beyond human comprehension, patient beyond mortal understanding, and utterly without the capacity for what we would recognize as mercy or love. Mather had attempted to combat the creature through prayer and holy water, through exorcism and the burning of sacred texts, but nothing had affected it beyond temporary inconvenience. In the end, his community had been consumed just like all the others, leaving behind only empty houses and the minister's hidden journal as testimony to their fate. It spoke to me of cycles, Mather's final entry recorded, of patterns that repeat across continents and centuries, of harvests that must be gathered when human settlements reach the proper stage of development. This creature is not unique but part of something larger, a network of entities that serve purposes beyond our comprehension. When one area is depleted, they move on to fresh hunting grounds, following the expansion of civilization like predators following herds of prey. Margaret closed the journal with trembling hands, understanding finally that what had happened to her town was neither an isolated incident nor a cosmic accident. Samuel was part of a systematic process, a mechanism of spiritual entropy that had been operating since humans first gathered into permanent communities. The creature that had destroyed her marriage and consumed her neighbors was one agent among many, working toward goals that spanned not just geography but geological time. The knowledge should have provided some comfort, understanding that she and Nathaniel had not been uniquely cursed, but merely the latest victims in an ancient pattern. Instead, it filled her with a despair deeper than grief, a recognition that the horror she had witnessed was not an aberration to be prevented, but an inevitable aspect of human existence, as natural and unstoppable as storms or earthquakes, or the gradual wearing away of mountains by wind and rain. She returned to Massachusetts in the winter of her 7th year of exile, drawn by a combination of nostalgia and morbid curiosity to see what remained of the place that had once been her home. The town existed only as a name on old maps now, its buildings collapsed or reclaimed by forest, its streets grown over with brambles and saplings that had transformed the ordered geometry of civilization back into wilderness. The cemetery still stood, though many of the headstones had toppled, and the iron gate hung crooked on rusted hinges. Margaret walked among the graves, reading names she remembered from her former life, trying to reconcile these peaceful monuments with her memories of the horror that had consumed their community. The dead seemed properly dead here, safely contained beneath their markers, giving no sign of the supernatural disturbance that had once emptied their resting places. It was near sunset when she saw him, standing among the shadows cast by the bare winter trees. Samuel appeared exactly as she remembered, pale, motionless, ageless, his dark eyes reflecting the last light of day like pools of black water. He was not alone. Around him stood figures she recognized as former neighbors, their forms more substantial than memory, but less solid than living flesh, watching her approach with expressions of patient welcome. "Margaret," Samuel said, his voice unchanged by the years that had transformed her from young wife to solitary scholar. "I wondered when you would return to us. Your research has been quite thorough, quite illuminating. Few have understood our nature with such clarity." She stopped at the edge of the gathering, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her voice steady when she spoke. "I know what you are now. Not death itself, but something worse. A parasite that feeds on the human desire for peace, that transforms our greatest longing into our ultimate destruction." "Such harsh words," Samuel replied, tilting his head with that familiar expression of childlike curiosity. "Yet you understand better than most the gifts we offer. 7 years of investigation, 7 years of carrying the weight of knowledge that no one else can share or comprehend. Are you not tired, Margaret? Are you not ready to rest?" Behind him she could see Nathaniel's form among the gathered spirits, his face bearing the same expression of serene contentment that marked all of Samuel's congregation. Her husband raised his hand in greeting, his gesture carrying both recognition and invitation, love transformed into something that transcended human emotion. "Join us," Samuel continued, stepping closer with movements that left no prints in the frost-covered ground. "Your work is complete. Your questions answered, your burden of solitary knowledge ready to be laid down forever. Accept what your husband discovered, what your neighbors embraced, what countless communities before you have learned, that existence without suffering is not only possible, but preferable to the struggle you have endured. Margaret felt the familiar pull of Samuel's invitation working on her exhausted soul, offering an end to years of loneliness and research, and the terrible weight of being the sole witness to truths too horrible for human minds to accept. The prospect of joining Nathaniel, of existing in whatever realm sustained Samuel's congregation, held an appeal that made her knees weak with longing. But even as she felt herself wavering, a new understanding crystallized in her mind, a recognition that her refusal was itself part of some larger pattern, that her role was not to join the harvest, but to carry its story forward. Someone had to remember, someone had to preserve the record, someone had to warn future communities about the predators that moved among them wearing the faces of innocence. "No," she said, taking a step backward despite the pain the word caused her. "I choose to remember rather than forget, to carry this burden rather than lay it down, to remain among the living even if it means spending the rest of my life in isolation and sorrow." Samuel's expression did not change, but something shifted in the air around him, not anger or disappointment, but a kind of ancient approval, as if her refusal was itself part of whatever cosmic function he served. "You understand the cost of that choice, the years of solitude that await you, the knowledge that will separate you from every human connection you might otherwise form." "I understand," Margaret replied, though her voice trembled with the magnitude of what she was accepting, "and I choose it anyway." Samuel smiled, the expression carrying neither malice nor warmth, but something that might have been respect. "Then live, Margaret Harrow, with our blessing. Carry our story to those who come after, though few will believe and fewer still will understand. You have earned the right to your burden." As the last light faded from the winter sky, Samuel and his congregation began to fade as well, becoming transparent and then translucent and finally vanishing entirely like mist before morning sun. Margaret stood alone among the gravestones, shivering in the cold air, clutching the journal where she had recorded everything she had learned about the entities that harvested human communities like farmers gathering grain. She left the abandoned cemetery as full darkness settled over the ruins of her former home, walking toward the main road where a hired carriage waited to carry her back to Providence. Behind her, the empty town settled into the silence that had claimed it years earlier, a silence that would persist until the next wave of settlers arrived to build new homes on soil that had been prepared by forces beyond their comprehension. Margaret lived for 20 more years, never marrying again, never speaking openly about what she had witnessed, but always writing, recording accounts, preserving testimonies, building an archive that future researchers might discover if they possessed the wisdom to look and the courage to believe. When she died in 1837, her papers were donated to the Harvard Library, where they joined thousands of other documents deemed too fantastic for serious scholarship. But sometimes late at night when the library was empty and shadows moved in ways that had nothing to do with lamplight, those papers would be disturbed by small hands that left no prints, examined by dark eyes that reflected knowledge gathered across centuries of patient harvest. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would, with each new generation of humans building their communities in places where ancient predators waited with the infinite patience of entities that measured time in eons rather than heartbeats. And in the spaces between their settlements, in the forests that grew over abandoned towns and the silence that filled empty houses, something that wore the face of a child continued its eternal work, gathering souls like flowers and adding them to a collection that spanned continents and centuries, always growing, always patient, always ready to welcome the next community that would mistake its hunger for salvation and its predation for peace. The story ends not with resolution, but with recognition. The understanding that what happened to Dr. Nathaniel Harrow and his wife, to Samuel and the town that harbored him, was neither the first chapter nor the last in a book whose pages are written in the lives and deaths of countless human communities. Somewhere in some quiet corner of our modern world, another pale child stands at another window, watching and learning and preparing for the next harvest, while those who might recognize the signs remain as blind to the truth as their predecessors were centuries ago. Perhaps that blindness is itself a mercy, a protection against knowledge too terrible for human minds to bear. Or perhaps it is simply another aspect of the predator's camouflage, ensuring that each new community approaches its fate with the same innocence that has always made the harvest possible. In either case, the cycle continues, patient and eternal and utterly without the capacity for what we would recognize as mercy or love, waiting for the next Dr. Harrow to make the choice between knowledge and wisdom, between discovery and destruction, between the pride that dooms and the humility that might, just might, offer salvation to those wise enough to choose it.